Luther Strange was elected Alabama's 49th Attorney General in 2010. He was reelected to that office in 2014. As the Attorney General in Alabama, he is the chief law enforcement officer in this state. He oversees a team of lawyers and investigators who assist local law enforcement in solving cold cases and in prosecuting civil and criminal cases. His tenure in office has been marked by a strong emphasis on fighting white-collar crime, public corruption. He's a graduate of Tulane University. He's a person of faith, leader in the field of seeking reconciliation across racial barriers and many other things that divide us, bringing us together as one people. And it's an honor to have him with us today here at this conference. And so I ask now you to join in welcoming Alabama Attorney General Luther Strange.
Well, thank you, Dr. George. Adjust this just a little bit so y'all can hear me. The podium's not exactly made for me. And Bishop Baker and Mayor Riley, that was magnificent. William, thank you for those comments. It's an incredible honor for me to be here and get to address you in this beautiful, beautiful place this morning. I've been asked to talk about the message delivered to us from the mayors, add any wisdom or insight that I might have on what they've said, and give you my perspective as a native of Birmingham, and then talk a little bit about my job as Attorney General and the rule of law and how we interact with our citizens, what we're doing. As I said, it's an honor to be here at Beeson and in a religious setting, although I feel uncomfortable around all these clergymen and my own bishops here, Bishop Sloan, and I acknowledge him. But my mother did tell me as I got a little older that she tried to set me out along the right path. She said, I've made sure that you were born in a Catholic hospital from over at St. Vincent's Hospital, it's right down the street. Catholic hospital from a Protestant mother delivered by a Jewish doctor. So that's the truth. That's actually the history of my start, and I think it's paid benefits. Being here in Sanford is important to me. I grew up just literally about a mile from here in Homewood, and I used to spend my time walking around the campus, and as I got older and started playing basketball, slipping into the gym over here on the campus, and then getting run out all the time. But that's where I got my start. My mother was actually a secretary here at Sanford when I was in high school. It's Shades Valley High School right across the way. Well, it used to be. Now it's moved, but here in this Homewood community. And I know you're going to hear from Dr. Wayne Flint later today. My mother was actually his secretary in the history department. That's how far back that goes. So I'm a son of Birmingham. I'll tell you, that's where I come from. That's my perspective here, and I want to kind of follow up on what the mayor said. William and I probably about the same age, grew up here in the same city, probably had a slightly different perspective, although I remember Cousin Cliff and all the shows he mentioned in Birmingham in those days. I was 10 years old in 1963, in September of 1963, when the church was dynamited right down on 16th Street. 4 little girls were murdered in one of the most heinous crimes in history, not only of our state, but of our country. The youngest of the 4 girls was 11, 1 year older than I was. The other 3 girls were 14. We were the same age, really. And, I couldn't understand really what was going on. I was 10 years old, but I sure didn't know about it. And it jarred my conscience even as a young man. I attended Shades Cobb Elementary School. It was segregated in those days, although, like William said, I didn't understand that, and I didn't know the meaning of it one way or another. I didn't know where the other children went to school. I just went to my little school. I walked over there to school. I was on the safety patrol at Shades Cobb Elementary School. I guess it was my love for law enforcement or the rule of law. If you've never been in the safety patrol, you escort these kids. And when I was, I guess, maybe 11, I think it was 1964, the Safety Patrol got to take a trip to Washington, D.C., and we got to go see our national monuments on the train. And when we were up there, we were supposed to march in a parade, so it must have been one of the holidays, national holidays. They had little parades with bands and stuff, and we were going to walk right down Pennsylvania Avenue. And we were getting ready for the parade. This memory came to me as I was thinking about this talk today. And the teachers came in and got us in a room and said, "I'm sorry, children, but we're not going to be able to march in the parade." And we're like, "What do you mean? We want to walk? It's a parade," they said. And, you know, I think in our own little young understanding, what the teachers were telling us was, we don't think it'd be safe for kids from Birmingham in 1963 or 4 to be walking in a parade. The history gets lost, but back in those days, Washington was practically on fire. There were lots of civil disobedience. I don't know if they made the right call or not. I still wish I had been in that darn parade. But it was another example of little things that come in. I saw how people were treated. I saw the different signs. Why did somebody have to go to the back of the restaurant to get served and somebody could go in the front door? Things that you try to absorb in a child's mind. Fast forward to when desegregation occurred in Alabama. It occurred in 1965. That's when the order was issued. But you know, in the South, a lot of foot dragging was involved in that process. And my schools weren't desegregated until 1968. So I was starting high school. And you know, that was a blessing in so many more ways than I can tell you, because at the same time they desegregated schools, they closed a school that's no longer here, of course, called Rosedale School. And it was the minority community in Homewood, and I lived in the other community. Rosedale was closed, and so the kids were joined together in school. Now, we hadn't really grown up playing with these kids, and we didn't know exactly what the background was. It was very apparent to me, even in those days, they hadn't had the same advantages I had had. They hadn't had the same resources that I had had. But they merged into our school. And here's where I think, at least in my life, God plays a role. You know, you look back on these things. It could have gone either way. It could have been, we don't like you people. We don't want you in our school. You're different. But because I was blessed with a lot of height and very little ability, but a desire to play basketball, I was on the team. And 2 or 3 of the kids that came over from Rosedale liked to play basketball. They were actually a really great team. And they came over and joined us. And so we got introduced every afternoon on the basketball court. And the first couple of days was like, well, we're better than you are. We were kind of like, well, we're the guys over on this team, and they're the guys over here. After they beat us a few times, pretty badly, we said, well, maybe we should start working together, because we all go to the same school, and we're going to have to play some other schools here before too long. And we learned that lesson of teamwork. And so by the time we graduated from high school 3 years later, we were an excellent basketball team. 3 black players, 2 white players. We played some schools that hadn't been integrated yet. We played some all-black schools, all-white schools. We were a diverse team, and it was based on friendship and teamwork. And that lesson brought our school together. It brought the kids together. You know, it could have gone in different ways. Other schools had problems with that issue, as we all know. At least the oldest, the people with salt and pepper hair, remember those days. It's not, thankfully, like that today. But we went on to play Parker High School in the finals of the state championship my senior year. It was an all-black school on the northern side of town. There were 17,000 people in Tuscaloosa. I would say 50-50 black and white. There were 2 white guys and 7 black guys on the court. We were very competitive. They beat us on a last-second shot. I've stayed friends with the guys on both teams to this very day, black and white. And I'm going to come back to that teamwork message, because it's my dream and my hope, and I think we're seeing this, that we can all as a society work together, because really we are all on the same team, and when you think about it. Later, as a college student, I had a unique opportunity, and it's odd that this has kind of come up in the news recently, but I was very interested in learning about how did the South get to be the way it was? How did we end up being in this situation? Learning the history that we all need to know and remember. And back in 1975, when I was a senior in college, I was taking a Southern history class, and I was just very interested in it. And I happened to see on TV a guy that was claimed to be the head of the Ku Klux Klan. And he was bragging about it, and he looked like he was about the same age as I was. And I went to my professor and said, I'd like to go interview this guy, because I just can't understand how anybody could be like that. And he said, well, he'll never see you. You'll never get to do that. But as it turned out, I was at Tulane. He lived in Baton Rouge. And I just picked up the phone, and I called up there, and I said, I'd like to come talk to you because I'm doing a paper from my class. And he said, oh, sure, come on up. You meet me for breakfast. And so I drive up to Baton Rouge and knock on the door, and opens the door is none other than David Duke, the Grand Dragon of the Ku Klux Klan. Growing up in Alabama, I had never seen anybody in the Ku Klux Klan. I know lots of people have or had, or I've heard stories, read all the books, but I never had come into contact. But there I was, face to face with the Grand Dragon. I guess he's still kicking around here somewhere. But I commenced to get about a 2-hour lecture on how bad African Americans were, how bad, and see, I was so uninformed. I didn't know what, how upset he was with the Jewish race. But it was a real seminar in bigotry and discrimination. And I went back to my professor and he said, I hope you didn't sign anything, you didn't ask for any mail, don't. He said, I can promise you the FBI is watching this guy, and if you get anything from him, you better be sure, and it goes to the university because the FBI knows we're trying to research him and everything. But anyway, that gave me an understanding right off the bat that racism is real. There's no question about it. Evil exists in the world. But what can we do about it? We live in Alabama, those of us who were born and raised here, with the legacy of George Wallace. There's no doubt about it. We have to acknowledge that, and I'm glad we acknowledge it. I'm glad we have the best civil rights museum in the United States. I think we should acknowledge it, and I'm very glad that we do. The first person I had to run against when I decided to make a difference and get involved in public office, or it could have been a case of temporary insanity, but I had to run against George Wallace Jr., and I found out every road and half the schools in this state are named after George Wallace. I mean, it's a legacy we have to acknowledge, but in doing that, it gives us a chance to think about and acknowledge how far we've come. We have come light years, miles and miles, maybe more than any community in the United States. This city and the leadership and the people of this city have set an example for the world. And I don't just say that academically because it's a polite thing to say. Before I got into public office, my interest and professional focus was on economic development, creating jobs for the people of this state, and representing companies and businesses around the world that wanted to come here to Alabama or somewhere, mainly in the Southeast, in the last 25 years, to establish jobs, to create good jobs, to come bring in different and new cultures. So I'll just mention one. The one large company that I represented was Hyundai, a Korean company that wanted to come to the United States. And I had the chance to go to Korea, spend a lot of time there. They're now a $2 billion company that makes over 1,500, almost 2,000 cars a day. They employ thousands of people right here in Montgomery. But the news about all that is they love Alabama. Whether it's a German company in Mobile, it's the same story that Mayor Bell shared with us. Once someone comes here, they love it, and you know why. But to see that kind of feedback from people internationally, it made me feel good because it means that they don't just think of Alabama and Birmingham as things that happened 50 or 60 years ago. They think about the future, and that's the way I try and look at my job and the way I approach things. So I always look at the glass as half full, and I think Alabama is setting a great example for the world. This seminar today is doing that very thing, and I'm just very proud to be a part of it. Now, I had a few remarks about what the mayor said, and they're right on target. It's the number one thing I'll say is leadership makes all the difference. In anything that you do, if you don't have good leadership, you are pretty much bound to fail. And we're blessed to have great leadership. Charleston is fantastically blessed to have that kind of leadership because, as Mayor Riley said, you don't know when a crisis will occur. You can be pretty sure one will occur at some point, and you need to be ready for it. And if you don't have the right leadership, that makes all the difference. So we're very, very lucky. William mentioned the new generation of kids. You know, most kids that are alive today have really no idea. The Civil Rights Movement, or 1963, might as well be the way I looked at the Civil War when I was 10 years old. It really wasn't in ancient history by any means, but it's not something that is on their minds. They don't understand the sacrifices that were made. They don't understand all the things that happened, and we have to continually impress on them the importance of it, because if you don't remember your history, of course, you're condemned to repeat it. And so I applaud that effort, and your congratulations on your new museum. That is going to be fantastic. William mentioned the importance of religion, and I want to stress that because the lack of a moral compass, and I'll talk about that in just a second when I talk about the challenges policemen and law enforcement face in today's world and the new type of policing we have to deal with. The lack of a moral compass of prayer is one of the key ingredients. And I applaud the churches and the churchmen and women who are here today. What you do is critically important. So I couldn't agree more about that. Neighborhood policing. I think the mayors have both alluded to this. You have to know who you're policing. You can't just come in and not be a part of the community and expect to have the respect of your citizens in law enforcement. And so I applaud. Birmingham has been a leader in this. You're going to hear from A.C. Roper, the police chief of Birmingham, in a minute. Birmingham has launched an initiative that's really cutting edge, and I applaud them for that because you have to be engaged in the community. I want to emphasize that. And we think, I'm talking about some things being in the distant past. William mentioned slavery, and you think, well, that is way in our past. But one of the biggest issues we as attorneys general in the 50 states and territories and internationally have to deal with is human slavery, human trafficking. It's not as obvious and present in our society as the old days, but it exists. It's real. It could be prostitution. It could be forced labor. It could be any number of things. But there is a slave trade, if you will, still existing in the world, and it preys on vulnerable people, on young women, immigrants, and people who can't fend for themselves. And so I can assure you that that is a high priority of law enforcement to deal with that. We just had a seminar to talk to law enforcement officers about how do you identify human slavery and human trafficking. You and I in this room might go to a 7-Eleven or go through a hotel on an interstate or something, and you might see things that you wouldn't necessarily notice. But a trained person who can understand the psychology and the dynamics of this kind of human trafficking could tell you and pick that up. We have some great faith-based institutions here in Birmingham that are on call 24/7. When those of us who don't want to think about these issues are sleeping, they're on call to go out in the middle of the night to a hotel room when a woman calls and says, can you come get me? Can you rescue me from this situation I'm in? So it's very important to keep that in mind as well, too. So let me talk a little bit about my role as Attorney General. I wanted to talk a little bit about it. I think it's the most rewarding job in public service. I don't have to give political speeches. I can talk about the things that make our country great, which is our Constitution, the rule of law, everything that underpins. We're not a nation of men. Politicians come and go. They have throughout the history of our country, and we faced awfully big issues. William mentioned Nelson Mandela. We had a civil war. Abraham Lincoln adopted the same sentiment as Nelson Mandela did when he said, with malice towards none and charity for all. And I'm paraphrasing. What an attitude to take after a battle that pitted our country literally against each other. But it's all about justice. I get to, and I pray that I'll have the wisdom, strength, courage to know and do God's will every day. But the ultimate goal is to provide justice for all of our citizens. I went back and reread Martin Luther King's letter from Birmingham jail. Have a copy of it that I keep handy, but I went back and read it again last night. And of course, he was responding to clergy. You're all familiar with the history of that. The first paragraph caught me and said, why am I in Birmingham? I'm in Birmingham because injustice is in Birmingham. And wherever injustice is, it's incumbent on attorneys general and police officers, all of our citizens, to be there and to address it. Well, let me talk about some factors that get into my world, that lead people into my world, which is the criminal justice system and dealing with those issues that I just talked about. And I'm going to talk about 4 factors that we typically see. If you wanted to pick out 90% of the people that end up in the criminal justice system, what do they have in common? What can we learn from that, and how can we address it? And I'm going to talk about 4 factors. Not one of them is race. Race is not one of the factors that I'm going to talk about. One is a lack of a stable home environment. People end up in the criminal justice system because they don't have any guidance, any leadership at home. They may be born into tough circumstances. I was blessed to have 2 parents, although they worked very hard. They took great care of me and my sister. We weren't wealthy by any means, but I had a role model. I was blessed that I had coaches that would jerk me up after school, and I had to spend every day in practicing and getting worn out. I was very involved in Young Life, which was a Christian organization when I was in high school. I was an Eagle Scout. I was at summer camp. All those mentors made a difference in my life, but not every child. It's not really a matter of money, too, I should add, to have those kind of influences. You don't have to be rich to be in the Boy Scouts or to go out for a sports team. But so many of our children and youth are not blessed with those assets. So not coming from a stable home environment is a very, very tough strike against you right off the bat. Second thing is a lack of a good education. If you don't have a good education and you can't get a job, you're almost condemned to a situation where you're going to be behind the curve throughout the whole process. So I know there are educators here. We're in the presence of a magnificent chapel on a beautiful university site. What happens in our education system affects all of us, and it's critically important to keep people on the right path. You know, I always think about the old biblical admonition, start a child out in the way that he shall go, and when he is older, he will not depart therefrom. It's really true, and it really is important. The third thing is, and this is practically an epidemic in our society, is the presence of drugs, some sort of alcohol or drug addiction or problem. So many of the crimes that we see and we have to deal with have to do with drugs. There's a heroin epidemic in our community. Chief Roper and others know about it. That issue, if you want a statistic, and I'm not much on giving out statistics, but Alabama's number 1 in football. We're also number 1 in the prescription of opioids and narcotics in the United States. There's actually a prescription for, there's 1.5 prescriptions for opiates for every citizen in the state of Alabama, man, woman, and child. That's 1.5 prescriptions per person. 6 million prescriptions a year. We have 4 million citizens. There's something not right with that picture. And it gets expensive, then you go to heroin and on down the line. We're very much involved in dealing with that issue, and it makes it tough on law enforcement. The last thing I'll talk about, and I didn't know the mayors were going to talk about the moral compass, but the fourth factor that we see in the criminal justice system is a lack of a moral compass. It's hard for us to relate to it, but when you see, it's just heartbreaking to see the pictures in the paper, to go to a local jail and you see someone who's taken someone else's life with almost no remorse, with almost no guilt at all. And you wonder, how can that be? How can a person get to that stage? And it's because I truly believe they don't have a moral compass. They have no faith or anything else to teach them those values. And of course, when you don't have someone giving you the right values, you're going to find someone who will give you values. And unfortunately, too often it's someone in a gang or someone else. The police forces get a bad rap today. Ferguson is an example, and it's touched a nerve around the country, and I won't get into that. There's been tons of analysis about it. Baltimore, and you can go down the list. Here in Montgomery, less than a week ago, just south of here, an African-American gentleman was killed by a police officer. I think, Mayor, we're seeing in Montgomery what you experienced to some extent in Charleston. You know, that could be the occasion for a tremendous problem in the community, but the mayor and the faith community, the ministers and others who care about this issue have come together. And just yesterday, that officer who was involved in this shooting was indicted for murder. I'm confident that justice will play out there, and that the victim's family and the officer will get their day in court, and it will be resolved, which is the way it should be resolved in our state. So there are a few bad apples in law enforcement. I won't deny that. I've, as Attorney General, prosecuted half a dozen corrupt law enforcement officials. It makes me very sad when somebody tarnishes the badge, but if they do, they're going to be prosecuted. But what is overlooked, and maybe that's just the nature of the news cycle and the news people, if it bleeds, it leads, and all of that. We never give the law enforcement men and women in our communities the credit that they really, truly deserve, because they are peace officers. That's what a police officer is, a peace officer. Paul talks about it in Romans. And they go out every day to keep the peace under very, very difficult circumstances, never knowing what they're going to see or find. For every incident of a case like Montgomery that I just mentioned, there are dozens, hundreds, thousands of incidents every day where a police officer's changing a tire or starting a car or buying shoes for a family that can't afford them here in Birmingham. And they buying a lady caught shoplifting. She didn't have any money for her children. The police department gets together, buys the food and groceries, takes them to her house. And they don't do it for the credit or for the accolades, and they don't ask for money to do it. They use their own money, and they're not highly paid. They're not paid nearly enough. And they're also willing to put their lives on the line. So since I've been Attorney General, it's been 5.5 years. There have been 17 police officers in Alabama who've lost their lives in the line of duty. 17. I went to my first funeral of a fallen officer. I had only been in office maybe 2 months. 3 of those officers that I mentioned to you were killed in felonious assaults. Some died in heart attacks, car crashes, other ways. 3 of them were killed in felonious assault. So one officer was killed chasing a drug dealer through the streets of Anniston. He was white, the offender was black, and he was killed. That person's been convicted. The second one was a black police officer who arrested a black defendant, had him in a police car and was stabbed with a secret knife the felon had. He was killed, black on black. The third one was a white sheriff who was shot by a white suspect and died. So the point of all that is that type of violence doesn't respect race or region or anything else. It could apply to anybody, and every police officer that goes out every day for Chief Roper or any of the other ones knows what they can face. A couple of other things. We clearly need to work together in our communities, and I applaud Chief Roper and his initiative, and I hope he'll have a chance to talk about it. Going into those communities and identifying those kids that may have some of the characteristics, the 4 characteristics that I mentioned to you, and getting to them first, and getting to them to give them options for their lives. Sometimes if you come from an environment, you think that's the only environment I can ever be in. I can never get out of this environment. But that's not true. And the efforts to say you don't have to choose the path of violence. That only leads to bad things. You can choose the path of school, and we'll help you do it. And you can identify those areas. One initiative that I'm proud of that I've started doing in Montgomery, and we happily borrowed this from Los Angeles, is something called the iLead program. And it's a mentoring program for inner city kids, and we do it in the 4th grade in Montgomery. And we go in, I go in with some of my lawyers, and our police officers go in, and we talk about just simple things like beware of gangs, watch for drugs. All of it is part of saying we're law enforcement in your community, and we care about you, and we want to know how we can help you. We don't want you to be afraid of the police, because it's pretty sobering when you asked on the first day, does anybody in this classroom know anybody in prison? And about 75, 80% of the hands go up. Or do you know anybody who's been shot? Hands go up. Ever have to call 911? Hands go up. That probably doesn't happen in a lot of the schools that I know many of your children attend, my children, and it's got to be addressed. We've got to focus on things that work in that environment, again, for children who don't have the advantages that we've been blessed to have. Finally, and I'll conclude with this, I want to talk a little bit about gun violence. It's a big, big problem in our society. We're trying to work through how to deal with it. I recently testified in Washington on some of those things, and I'll be happy to talk about it on the panel if you'd like me to elaborate on it. But there are several things that we know work and that we can do, and I've urged the Congress to help us do. I think Chief Roper understands this because he never knows, no officer ever knows who's got a gun. We know people that are thugs and criminals won't bother to register or tell us that they have them, but we can do things like make sure that people who commit crimes with guns are taken off the streets and we divert them off that path or make our cities safer, because it's no longer fist fights and knife fights, it's guns, unbelievably. Emergency room physicians will tell you that. It used to be knives that came in. Now we never see knives. Now we see guns, and the guns get bigger and bigger. The second thing we need to do is, and I think probably the most important thing that is most neglected in law enforcement, is the problem of mental illness. We have got to do something more to address the problem of mental illness. I don't know of any family that doesn't have some experience with mental illness in their family, and there are precious few resources for a family dealing with that problem. And I've urged Congress, we have to do it at the state level, we have to deal with that issue, because right now what happens is our mentally ill are being taken care of in police cells where they don't get treatment. We don't eliminate any risk. They go back on the streets and can become violent. We all know the problems that happen when they get a gun and something gets into their head, and then we have a tragedy on our hands. But I'm going to get back to where I started, which was that I'm very optimistic about the future of our communities. I'm so blessed to get to work with the men and women in law enforcement. I'm so pleased with the progress that's been made in my state. I'm a huge cheerleader for Alabama and the progress we've made. Every time I see a negative article, even if we deserve it or not, I always am encouraged when I drive through the streets, and it doesn't matter what town I'm in. And I'm always in my car. I don't have an airplane or anything like that. I just drive back roads, and I go past schools, playgrounds, the community I grew up in, Homewood, and it's black, white, every group. Kids don't know the difference. They don't know the history. They're not depressed about what happened in 1963. They're happy to have the great advantages of living in this beautiful state. And that's just so encouraging to me as a new grandfather to see the progress we've made. So we can't ever forget it. I truly believe if we rely on two things, and this is a dangerous thing for me, being a chapel preaching my own ministers here, and this is really nerve-wracking, but the two things that I think really will make a difference to us, I really believe this is: one's God's grace. We live in a fallen world, we know that, but I think we can count on God's grace. And the other thing is the Great Commission in Matthew, trust in God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul, and then treat your neighbor as you would treat yourself. Those are the two great commandments, and on those hang all the law and the prophets. I truly believe that, and if we in law enforcement do that, if you do that, if our state leaders do that, then I couldn't be more optimistic for the future of our great state. Thank you so much for letting me be with you.